It is the 7th century in the Tang dynasty, an empire whose heart beats through corridors of jade, ritual, and silence. You find yourself standing in the capital of Chang'an, a city whose streets were laid out like a grid of quiet precision. Each district had its curfew bell, each gate had its guard, each market had its inspector. The morning mist over the city carries the smell of wet earth, burnt incense, and horse dung. It is not a romantic scent, but a practical one, the odor of a working empire. Civil officials move like shadows in long black robes, carrying bamboo slips of records, each stamped with the mark of a bureaucrat's brush. The Tang Empire at this time was not simply ruled by emperors. It was administered by the slow, rhythmic turning of paperwork. And somewhere inside this great machinery of administration, a young girl named Wu Zhao was quietly entering history. Wu Zhao was born around 624 CE, in what is now Shaanxi province. Her father, Wu Shihuo, was a timber merchant who later gained minor official status. It was a comfortable life, not extraordinary, but stable, a life built on measured prosperity, on family records, and the Confucian values of diligence. Her mother came from a family of minor officials, and young Wu was educated at home, unusual for a girl, but not unheard of in an upwardly mobile family. She learned to read, to write poetry, to play the qin. But more importantly, she learned to observe. The empire, vast and ancient, moved according to patterns, human patterns, and she watched them carefully. At 14, she was sent to the imperial palace as a Karen, a 5th-rank concubine of Emperor Taizong. This was not a romantic posting. The palace, with its hundreds of women, was less a home and more a living bureaucracy of affection. Each concubine had a title, a rank, a number of attendants, and a carefully calculated daily routine. The palace women were not chosen simply for beauty. They were chosen for balance of family, temperament, and potential loyalty. Once inside, they became part of an invisible system of order. The emperor would summon them according to a rotation recorded by eunuchs. Meals were logged, births were noted. Even the emperor's silences were recorded by scribes, who waited just outside his chambers. Wu Zhao's position was low, but her education and poise made her noticeable. She was quiet, observant. She did not complain or flatter excessively, and in the stillness of court life, that quietness became its own kind of power. Emperor Taizong was a pragmatic ruler. He valued intelligence in his attendants, and Wu Zhao, through patient observation, began to gain his notice. It is said she learned the duties of record-keeping, assisted in reading reports, and once commented insightfully on military strategy. But when Taizong died in 649 CE, everything changed. According to Tang custom, concubines without children were sent to Buddhist convents after the emperor's death, not as a punishment, but as a closing of the imperial chapter. Their lives were considered fulfilled in service, and retirement to a convent was seen as a form of moral completion. So Wu Zhao, still young, perhaps 26, was sent to Ganye Temple, her head shaved, her silks replaced with rough monk's robes. Here, the rhythm of history slowed. The temple's corridors were silent, except for the low hum of chanting. The smell of incense and pine oil filled the air. Wu Zhao spent her days copying sutras, tending the incense burners, and sweeping stone floors polished by centuries of feet. It would have been an easy story to end here, one of thousands of forgotten women in imperial China, fading into the obscurity of religious service. But Wu Zhao's story, like history itself, resists simplicity. Outside the temple walls, the Tang court continued. Emperor Taizong's son, Gaozong, now ruled. He had been a young prince during Wu Zhao's time at court, and stories differ on whether he had known her then. What is certain is that, years later, he visited the temple and saw her again. Gaozong's wife, Empress Wang, was politically astute, but struggled to secure her husband's affection. She had no surviving son, and another consort, Xiao Shufei, was gaining influence. In an unexpected turn, Empress Wang suggested that Gaozong bring back Wu Zhao from the convent, hoping perhaps to divide his attention or shift court dynamics in her favor. The suggestion worked, though not in the way she hoped. Wu Zhao returned to the palace, her head grown hair again, her posture humble but steady. She was reintroduced not as a widow of Taizong, but as a new concubine of Gaozong, a shocking breach of custom. To become both the concubine of the father and later the son was unprecedented, and it scandalized the Confucian elite. But Gaozong was captivated. Wu Zhao's intelligence, serenity, and skill in navigating palace politics made her stand out in a court crowded with ambition. Behind the silken screens, she began the careful work of power. She understood that affection was fleeting, but administration was lasting. She studied the routines of eunuchs, the flow of petitions, the nuances of imperial decrees. She learned who truly held influence, not the ones who shouted, but the ones who copied documents and sealed them with wax. Her attention to small bureaucratic details made her an indispensable presence in Gaozong's life. He trusted her judgment, sought her advice on appointments, and valued her restraint. Still, the court was divided. Empress Wang and Consort Xiao each had supporters. The palace became a labyrinth of alliances, whispered accusations, and carefully planted rumors. Wu Zhao moved quietly among them, neither rushing nor resisting. The story of her rise is often told in extremes as ruthless ambition or divine destiny, but in truth, it was administrative patience. She waited, observed, and made herself indispensable. In 654 CE, she gave birth to a daughter. The child's sudden death became the fulcrum of palace crisis. Wu Zhao accused Empress Wang of murder, a charge that, whether true or not, led to Wang's downfall. The emperor's grief and guilt sealed the matter. By 655 CE, Wu Zhao was made empress consort, displacing both Wang and Xiao. The rituals were precise and lengthy. New seals were cast. New officials assigned to record her titles. Scribes updated imperial genealogies with quiet brushes, adjusting one name in a sea of ink. Wu Zhao, now Empress Wu. But to become empress was only the beginning. The empire she now influenced was vast. Over 50 million people, thousands of officials, hundreds of provinces. Its machinery ran on order and paperwork, and Wu Zhao's true power lay in understanding its rhythm. Still, the murmurs grew. Ministers questioned her legitimacy. Scholars cited the classics, "Under heaven, there has never been a female ruler." But she listened and said little. She sponsored temples, issued decrees under the emperor's name, and built alliances among bureaucrats who valued competence over tradition. Through slow years of petitions, edicts, and careful removals, her influence deepened. Her hand began to appear in the structure of government itself, in the reforms that expanded the civil service examination system, in the appointments of lower-born but loyal officials, and in the quiet removal of those who spoke too loudly against her. The court had long been ruled by dynastic precedent, but Wu Zhao saw something else, a state that could be ruled by the capable, rather than merely the noble. It was a radical idea, but expressed not through revolution, only through revisions to paperwork. Even as Gaozong's health began to fail from chronic illness, Wu Zhao's authority grew. She issued decrees in his name, attended audiences, and oversaw memorials from regional governors. And so, by the quiet turning of official seals, she began to rule. As you listen, imagine the rhythm of it, the scratching of brushes on silk, the echo of footsteps through marble halls, the subtle, constant hum of bureaucratic machinery. Power, in this world, was not seized in a single moment. It was built in the monotony of daily order of documents copied, stamped, and archived. And as night falls over the palace, the empress sits by candlelight, reading reports from distant provinces, her eyes calm, her mind alert. The empire does not yet know it, but its first and only female emperor has already begun her reign. When the Emperor Gaozong's illness began to worsen, palace life did not stop. It only adjusted its rhythm. Ministers continued to arrive at dawn. Eunuchs continued to bow and whisper, and memorials continued to pile in neat stacks on polished tables. The work of empire, like the flow of the Yellow River, could not be stopped, only redirected. Wu Zetian, still formerly Empress Wu, had learned this rhythm well. By 660 CE, Gaozong's headaches and dizziness, likely caused by a stroke, had left him weak and dependent. Audiences grew shorter. The emperor spoke less and deferred more. Gradually, Wu began to appear beside him at the council table, listening to ministers, answering questions in his stead. It was an unprecedented sight. An empress not only attending political matters, but actively directing them. The Tang court, with its intricate hierarchy, had no formal precedent for such dual authority. But Wu Zetian did not challenge tradition directly. Instead, she inhabited its spaces carefully, filling silences that others feared. Her command of detail, her memory for names and precedents, made her indispensable to an increasingly frail emperor. In time, ministers came to her first, out of practicality rather than defiance. This was the beginning of what later chroniclers called the Two-Sage Administration Gaozong, nominally emperor. Wu Zetian, his partner in governance. The arrangement was not official at first. It simply grew, like moss across old stone, until it became the ground beneath everyone's feet. You might imagine that power in an empire as vast as Tang China came from armies or decrees, but for Wu Zetian, it came from the paper trail, from the slow, deliberate flow of documents that passed through her hands. She established the Chancellery Secretariat as the heart of administration, a system that required all memorials and edicts to pass through layers of review. By controlling access and timing, she could delay an appointment, approve a project, or quietly end a career without ever raising her voice. The empire's machinery worked through her fingertips, not loudly, but persistently. Yet, every movement in the palace cast a shadow. The Confucian ministers were uneasy. To them, Wu Zetian's influence was a disruption to the cosmic order. The classic of rites spoke of a hierarchy under heaven, father before son, husband before wife, ruler before subject. A woman who ruled even indirectly seemed to threaten this balance. The memorials grew sharper. The scholar official Chu Suiliang, once a loyal advisor to Taizong, wrote scathing petitions, warning of female usurpation. Wu Zetian did not respond publicly, but slowly, methodically, her opponents began to lose their posts. Some were reassigned to distant provinces, others retired, voluntarily. One was imprisoned for corruption, another for slander. None of these punishments were dramatic. They were administrative, procedural, the quiet erosion of resistance. Meanwhile, Wu Zetian cultivated new allies. She promoted younger officials who had risen through the civil service examinations rather than through hereditary connections. These men, many from modest families, were grateful and loyal. Among them was Di Renji, a name later immortalized in legends as a symbol of honest governance. Wu Zetian recognized in such figures a practical truth. Loyalty often grows where gratitude is fresh. Her reforms extended beyond personnel. She reorganized land distribution records, ensuring that taxation was fairer and more consistent. She tightened control over provincial governors, requiring more frequent reports and financial audits. These measures were tedious, unglamorous but effective. Grain supply stabilized, revenues improved. The machinery of empire ran more smoothly, even as critics whispered of her ambition. Outside the palace walls, the people of Chang'an continued their lives. The markets hummed with trade silk from the south, horses from the steppe, spices from distant India. Pilgrims passed through the city gates, carrying scriptures and relics. Monks debated fine points of Buddhist doctrine beneath the shade of cypress trees. The empire was alive, its pulse steady, and Wu Zetian's influence was everywhere in the regularity of tax receipts, in the appointment lists, in the efficient rotation of local magistrates. But still, she faced resistance not from armies, but from ideology. The Confucian scholars clung to the notion that heaven's mandate could not descend upon a woman. Wu Zetian's response was not defiance, but redirection. She turned to Buddhism, which held broader interpretations of virtue and enlightenment. In Huayin, she sponsored the carving of the Dayun Sutra, proclaiming that Maitreya, the future Buddha, could manifest in female form. The temple murals began to feature a compassionate, regal bodhisattva, resembling the empress herself. It was a quiet transformation, the divine image becoming political justification. She also restored and expanded major temples, sponsoring lavish sutra transcriptions. Buddhist monks began to speak of her as a ruler of destiny. By aligning herself with Buddhist virtue rather than Confucian hierarchy, Wu Zetian reframed the discussion. She was not breaking order. She was fulfilling it. In 665 CE, she began appearing in public ceremonies beside Gaozong, dressed in yellow, a color traditionally reserved for emperors. Her seal bore the inscription, Heavenly Empress. She did not yet claim the throne, but she no longer stood behind it. By now, the emperor's condition was so fragile that ministers rarely saw him alone. The daily audiences, once formal affairs of consultation, had become more symbolic than functional. The empress handled most affairs of state. Her critics continued to vanish into administrative obscurity. The scholar Xu Jingzong, a skilled bureaucrat, became one of her key allies, helping her draft edicts and subtly revise imperial chronicles to frame her actions as extensions of virtue and necessity. Through such revisions, history itself began to bend around her. If you were a court official in this time, you might have felt the tension, a quiet, unspoken understanding that the center of power had shifted. The edicts bore the emperor's name, but the phrasing was hers. Ministers still bowed to Gaozong, but their eyes turned, inevitably, to the woman beside him. And yet, life in the palace remained ordered. The clocks of water and sand still measured the hours. The eunuchs still recorded audience notes. Meals were served precisely at the same time each day. The court was tranquil, even as it changed beneath the surface. Then, in 683 CE, Emperor Gaozong died. His reign had lasted 34 years. But in its final decade, Wu Zetian had been its living pulse. Tradition dictated that the Empress Dowager retire from politics, leaving the throne to her son, Emperor Zhongzong. But this son, kind and gentle, was also pliable, easily influenced by his wife, Empress Wei. Within weeks of his accession, Zhongzong made the mistake of speaking independently, suggesting appointments without consulting his mother. Wu Zetian removed him quietly, citing immaturity, and replaced him with his younger brother, Ruizong, who was more compliant. She assumed the title Empress Dowager, regent ruling, on behalf of the new emperor, but in truth, ruling alone. Outside, the people accepted this with little protest. The empire was stable, taxes regular, roads safe. The bureaucrats continued their work. Stability, after all, was the highest virtue of government. Few cared who signed the edicts, so long as the granaries were full and the canals well maintained. From this position, Wu Zetian began the final transformation of her rule. She moved the court to Luoyang, the eastern capital, surrounding herself with new ministers, scholars, and secretaries. The move itself was administrative, presented as practical. but it symbolized a new center of power, distinct from the Tang legacy. Her critics now operated under surveillance by the secret police, led by officials such as Lai Junchen. These enforcers recorded rumors, investigated treason, and ensured obedience. It was not a reign of terror by later standards, but it was one of constant caution. Each day, more memorials were written, reviewed, sealed, and sent. The empire became a vast network of words, every message passing through channels she had built. It is said that Wu Zetian spent hours each morning reading reports, personally noting details of grain prices, regional disputes, and temple repairs. Her endurance was legendary, a patience born of bureaucracy. Still, the question remained: would she stop here, as regent and guardian of the dynasty, or would she step beyond all precedent and claim the throne herself? The chronicles from this period become careful, even timid in their descriptions. They record her actions in neutral terms. Edict issued by the Empress Dowager. Proclamation of the Eastern Palace. Adjustment to the Bureau of Personnel. But between those lines, something irreversible was happening. In the stillness of routine, in the whisper of brushes over silk, the empire's first and only female emperor was quietly writing herself into existence. When the Empress Dowager Wu began to rule directly, the world did not collapse. The sun still rose over the palace walls. The river still flowed east. The bureaucrats still filed their petitions, and the tax collectors still balanced their ledgers. History, for all its drama, tends to unfold quietly. It was the year 690 CE, and the Tang dynasty, though still powerful, was entering a strange and delicate phase. Wu Zetian had ruled as regent for years, first for Emperor Zhongzong, then for Ruizong. But by now, both were little more than ceremonial figures. The officials of Luoyang whispered that heaven itself seemed to have shifted its gaze. Monks and scholars produced new omens: white stars over Mount Song, miraculous lotus blossoms blooming out of season, inscriptions appearing in sacred caves, predicting the rise of a holy sovereign mother. These were no accidents. Wu Zetian encouraged them not as superstition, but as political theology. The mandate of heaven had always been the cornerstone of Chinese legitimacy. It declared that a ruler governed by virtue, not by blood alone. Dynasties rose when virtue flourished and fell when corruption spread. For centuries, this idea had been used to justify revolutions, wars, and new dynasties. Now, Wu Zetian gave it a new interpretation. She argued that heaven's mandate was not bound by gender. If virtue and competence were the measures of divine favor, then heaven could choose a woman just as easily as a man. Her scholars supported this claim. One monk, Huilin, declared that the Great Cloud Sutra prophesied the arrival of a female ruler who would restore cosmic balance. Another scholar, Zhou Xingxi, produced elaborate commentaries aligning her virtues with Buddhist cosmology. Slowly, bureaucratically, the unimaginable became acceptable. In a series of carefully orchestrated ceremonies, Wu Zetian made her transition. She first accepted new honorific titles: Sage Mother, Holy, and Divine Emperor. Then, in October 690, she declared the founding of a new dynasty, the Zhou, interrupting the Tang lineage entirely. Her new reign title was Tianshou, meaning heavenly granted longevity. For the first time in over 2 millennia of imperial history, the throne of China was occupied by a woman. And yet, daily life at court changed little. Ministers still filed petitions in triplicate. Clerks still copied decrees into the archives. The rituals continued as before. Only the pronouns in the edicts had changed. The new dynasty's symbols were subtle, but deliberate. The imperial color shifted from the Tang's traditional red to blue, associated with the east, renewal, and the rising sun. The capital remained at Luoyang, symbolizing a fresh center of gravity. The new seal read, made by the Holy Mother, receiver of heaven's mandate. Wu Zetian governed with the same patient and precision that had brought her here. She expanded the civil service examinations, making merit rather than birth the main path to office. This reform, though tedious in its paperwork, had a quiet, revolutionary impact. It diluted aristocratic dominance and opened the bureaucracy to talent from lower social ranks. She also encouraged agricultural stability, commissioning irrigation repairs and new census surveys. Her government's efficiency records show meticulous attention to regional conditions. Grain quotas adjusted for drought, disaster relief dispatched with rare speed. Her critics called her ruthless, and perhaps she was. The secret police continued their investigations, ensuring loyalty and silencing dissent. Officials accused of treason were exiled, and some executed, though fewer than later legends claim. Still, even her harshness was methodical. Wu Zetian understood something fundamental about power, that it depended on stability. Fear was only a tool for ensuring order. It was the paperwork that truly ruled. In her court, the rhythm of administration became an art form. Every day began before dawn. Courtiers assembled in the hall of bright light, their breath visible in the cool air. The Empress-Emperor appeared behind a screen, her voice clear but calm, issuing edicts, receiving petitions, and listening to reports. She asked precise questions. The price of rice in Hunan, the grain storage levels in Guangdong, the condition of a particular canal. Ministers learned quickly that she remembered everything they said. At midday, she withdrew to read. She kept a circle of learned advisors, poets, astrologers, historians, not for flattery, but for perspective. She sponsored the compilation of the biographies of exemplary women, a text emphasizing female virtue, but also implicitly defending her own place in the moral order. She also commissioned the Deyun Jing, a grand Buddhist scripture celebrating female enlightenment. These acts were not vanity. They were policy, woven through theology and culture, normalizing her rule by surrounding it with sacred scholarship. Outside the palace, life for ordinary people remained steady. Trade routes thrived along the Silk Road. Monasteries flourished under imperial patronage. Pilgrims, merchants, and emissaries continued to pass through Luoyang's wide avenues. For the majority of the population, the question of the ruler's gender mattered less than the fact that taxes were predictable and harvests secure. Even so, the bureaucracy, that quiet, unfeeling organism, began to show signs of fatigue. By 700 CE, Wu Zetian was in her mid-70s. Her mind remained sharp, but her health began to fail. Ministers grew cautious. Factions re-emerged, whispering of the Tang princes who still lived in quiet retirement. She knew it could not last forever. Dynasties, like seasons, must turn. In her later years, Wu Zetian's reliance on a small circle of favorites, notably the Zhang brothers, young courtiers known for their charm, provoked resentment. The ministers, veterans of her long rule, saw weakness in her indulgence. In 705 CE, a palace coup erupted. Officials led by Zhang Jianji stormed the inner quarters, killing the Zhang brothers and forcing Wu Zetian to abdicate in favor of her son, Zhongzhong, restoring the Tang dynasty. The empress, now simply the retired sovereign, withdrew quietly. She died later that year, at the age of 81, after ruling directly or indirectly for nearly half a century. Her tomb lies in the Qianling Mausoleum. Beside Emperor Gaozong, her stele, unlike any other, stands blank. No inscription, no praise, no condemnation, just smooth stone facing the wind. It is said that she ordered it so, leaving judgment to history. And so ends the story of Wu Zetian, not as a tale of cruelty or seduction, as her enemies would later claim, but as one of endurance, intelligence, and an unshakable sense of order. She ruled an empire, not through conquest, but through comprehension, through her understanding of how people and paperwork moved. Her reign left no monuments of conquest, but its influence ran deep. The expansion of meritocracy, the stability of bureaucracy, the subtle idea that ability could, at least for a time, outweigh tradition. The wind over her tomb is silent, but perhaps it carries the echo of her reign, a quiet, relentless rhythm, like the turning of a bureaucrat's brush, like the empire itself, steady, eternal. And perhaps, as you drift towards sleep, you might wonder if history had been written not by those who feared her, but by those who simply understood her patience. How different would the story sound? In the 16th century, Venice did not roar like other empires. It murmured. It murmured through the scratching of quills, the shuffling of papers, the counting of coins, and the quiet drip of water against its marble walls. The Republic of Venice, La Serenissima, the most serene one, was an empire without vast fields or legions. Its dominion was built not on conquest, but on documentation. Its citizens did not wield swords, but styluses. Its governors did not shout commands. They wrote them. Imagine it, the morning bells of San Marco echoing across the lagoon, gondoliers calling to one another in dialect, the faint smell of salt, fish, and parchment rising together as sunlight filters through the damp air. The city is alive, but in an orderly way, as if its heart beats to the rhythm of recorded transactions. Every morning, at the Rialto, merchants gather. They wear long, dark robes, their faces weathered by the Adriatic wind. Around them stand scribes, young men, with ink-stained fingers and careful posture. They carry bundles of parchment, bound with string. These are not romantic letters or poems, but ledgers, the true soul of Venice. Each ledger is a living document, filled with columns of trade, one line for salt from Servia, another for pepper from Alexandria, another for glass beads from Murano, another for wax, wool, or tin. The ledgers record weights, costs, ship names, and the names of partners, because trust in Venice was written down. Venice, at its height, was a city of perhaps 150,000 souls, pressed into an archipelago of islands, where space was precious and memory unreliable. Everything had to be recorded. Births, marriages, taxes, loans, even the arrival of pigeons were logged somewhere, in some dusty room watched over by a patient clerk. The heart of this administrative world was the Scuola dei Mercanti, the Guild of Merchants. It was not just a guild, but an informal university, where young men learned not rhetoric or war, but arithmetic, bookkeeping, and the laws of commerce. Here, they learned to read the double-entry ledger, a method imported from the Florentine banks and perfected by Venetian clarity. It was the quiet revolution that made Venice rich. In a world before calculators, merchants relied on abacus boards, their beads clicking softly in dim light. They wrote their entries by hand, in fine, regular columns, one side for credit, one for debit, ensuring every sale, every shipment, every promise balanced itself in ink. A merchant's success depended not only on courage at sea, but on precision in numbers. To lose a page or miscalculate a shipment could ruin an entire family. And so, the Venetian trader was not a gambler. He was a mathematician with calloused hands. In the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, near the Rialto Bridge, foreign merchants from the German states conducted their trade under careful Venetian supervision. Their ledgers, too, had to match those of their Venetian partners. Inspectors from the Republic checked them periodically, ensuring fair taxes and preventing fraud. Even the smallest discrepancy, an unrecorded shipment, a missing seal, could bring an audit, a fine, or a quiet visit from the Magistrato alle Biade, the grain office, The grain office was one of the Republic's most important institutions. Bread, not gold, was the foundation of stability. Every loaf that reached Venetian tables began its journey as a line in a ledger. From the wheat fields of Apulia to the bakeries of the Castello district, the Republic measured its survival in sacks of grain and entries of weight. Every week, clerks reported on prices, storage conditions, and spoilage. Their reports travelled by courier to the Doge's palace, where they were bound in volumes stacked floor to ceiling. These were not thrilling documents, but they were the arteries of empire, feeding the people, preventing unrest. Inside the Doge's palace, behind its gilded halls and portraits of past rulers, was a quieter world. The Cancelleria Ducale, the ducal chancery. It was a labyrinth of narrow rooms, full of shelves and papers. Here worked the capi de cancelleria, heads of office, and their scribes. They wore black robes and white collars, symbols of discipline and impartial service. Each scribe took an oath of secrecy. They could not discuss their work outside the office. They wrote with goose quills, trimmed every few hours to keep their points sharp. They used black ink for text, red for corrections or seals, and they worked in silence. Their only company, the slow rhythm of their own breathing, and the scratching of 100 pens. From these rooms flowed the lifeblood of Venice decrees, trade licenses, tax rolls, diplomatic letters, and lists of ships entering and leaving the lagoon. A ship could not leave port without a patente di navigazione, an official license sealed by the Chancery. The captain had to record his crew, his cargo, and his route. On return, he would present his ledger, the Libro di Viaggio, which noted every port of call, every storm, every lost barrel of salt or wine. The bureaucracy was immense, but strangely elegant, a self-regulating organism that ensured honesty through documentation. Venice did not rely on faith alone. It trusted only the written word. Beyond the Chancery and the Grain Office were dozens of other magistracies. The Provveditori, alla Sanità, Health Office, who inspected incoming ships for plague. The Ufficio del Sale, which managed salt, imports the Republic's most reliable revenue. And the Giudici del Proprio, who handled commercial disputes. Each had its records, its books, its own brand of quiet power. Consider the Office of Salt. The salt tax, the Gabella del Sale, was the Republic's financial backbone. Salt preserved meat, fish, and even ink mixtures. The office maintained registers of every ounce imported, every sale authorized, and every merchant licensed to trade it. The records were so thorough that modern historians can reconstruct daily Venetian life from them who ate, what they ate, and at what price. Even the gondoliers were subject to bureaucracy. Licenses recorded their names, their routes, their fares. Some were passed from father to son, annotated with tiny notations of approval. The Republic functioned not by charisma, but by continuity. Yet for all its paperwork, Venice was not without beauty. The Archivio di Stato, the state archive, was a place of strange serenity, the scent of wax and vellum mingling with salt air from the canals. Light filtered through lattice windows, illuminating row upon row of bound books. Their edges uneven, but lovingly labelled in neat cursive. Each spine bore a number, a name, and a date. Taken together, they formed a memory, a collective intelligence spanning centuries. The Republic's scribes believed that nothing, not even a small market transaction, should be forgotten. To remember was to exist. And so Venice existed not through battles or monuments, but through the act of remembering itself. By the late 1500s, these ledgers connected Venice to nearly every corner of the known world. The ships of the Republic sailed to Alexandria, Constantinople, London, and Lisbon. They carried wool, pepper, silk, and alum, but what they brought back most of all was information prices. winds, routes, markets. That information, too, went into the ledgers. A captain who failed to report accurately could lose his license. A clerk who falsified numbers could be exiled. The penalty for carelessness was not death, but dishonor, the slow erasure of one's name from the ledgers of the Republic. Venetians feared that more than anything, each night, as the bells of St. Mark's Basilica rang for Concubine, the city's scribes extinguished their lamps and closed their books. The canals reflected the stars like sheets of dark ink. Somewhere, a clerk would seal a document with warm wax and press the mark of the winged lion into it, the final touch of order before sleep. Venice was quiet, then not dead, but dormant. Its life was stored safely on its shelves. And as the moonlight drifted over the lagoon, one might imagine that the city itself was dreaming not of conquest or glory, but of accuracy. It is strange to think that an empire could rise and endure for centuries on the strength of balance sheets, but that was the Venetian miracle. Its soldiers were clerks, its weapons were pens, and its conquests were columns of numbers that always, somehow, added up. But as Venice's ledgers grew heavier, the world outside began to change. New powers, Portugal, Spain, and later, the Dutch were learning to do what Venice did. The question that would come to define the next century was a quiet one, but inevitable. Could a republic of ink survive a world of empire and gunpowder? In the year 1571, when the guns of the Battle of Lepanto echoed across the sea, Venice listened carefully, but not in fear. It listened like a clerk pausing his pen to hear a sound from another room. The Republic had weathered storms before floods, fires, plagues, and wars, and had always survived, not through passion, but through paperwork. For the Venetians, the world was not divided into land and sea, but into entries and margins. Everything, every pearl, every ship, every sailor, had a number beside it. It was not poetry that sustained the Republic, but arithmetic. After the fleets returned from Lepanto, battered, triumphant, but at great cost, the Doge's secretaries began the real work. They drew up casualty lists, calculated losses, and tallied the expenses of rebuilding ships. For months, the sound of scratching pens in the Cancelleria Ducal drowned out even the sound of the waves outside. Venice's genius was not military courage, but administrative endurance. Where other states saw battle, Venice saw data, the bureaucracy of the sea. By the late 1500s, Venice's bureaucracy was a living organism, vast, intricate, and quietly self-aware. It stretched from the smallest office clerk to the highest council of the Republic, the Consiglio dei Dieci, the Council of Ten. Each branch, each office, produced reports, memoranda, and ledgers that all connected like veins to the beating heart of the state archive. The Republic was run not by kings, but by paper, bound, numbered, and filed in precise order. The Venetian government employed hundreds of scribes, known as noti and cancelliere. Many began as apprentices in their teens, learning the slow art of copying letters without error. They were not allowed to improvise or paraphrase. A document had to be copied exactly, for even a single misplaced comma could alter the meaning of a law. Their handwriting, the distinctive Venetian chancery script, was a form of discipline in itself. Smooth, slanted, and precise. It gave even the dullest inventory a quiet dignity. These scribes understood something profound, that empires die when their memory fails. And so they labored to make Venice unforgettable. At the height of the Republic, there were more than 30 magistracies, each with its own archives. Some handled trade with specific regions. The Cinque Savi alla Mercanzia oversaw foreign commerce, while the Savi agli Ordini managed maritime law. Others focused on the city's survival. The Provveditori alle Acque controlled water flow and flood prevention. The Ufficio delle Biade monitored grain. Every decree they issued, every report they received, every inspection they ordered, all was written down. Venetian law required 3 identical copies of every official record. One for the office, one for the chancery, and one for the central archive. To walk through the archive in those days was to walk through centuries. Each shelf a timeline of human persistence, the paper ships. But bureaucracy did more than preserve order. It built the Republic's fleets. Venice's shipbuilding marvel, the Arsenale, was a city within the city. By the 16th century, it employed around 16,000 workers, carpenters, caulkers, rope makers, blacksmiths, and scribes. The Arsenale was the closest thing the medieval world had to a factory organized, methodical, and astonishingly efficient. Each ship began not with timber, but with paperwork. The order for a new galley would pass through layers of offices. First, the Senato Marittimo, which approved the expense. Then, the Provveditori all'Arsenale, who assigned the craftsmen. And finally, the Revisori, who verified the costs and materials. Nothing was built without a form. Every plank had a record. Every rope had a receipt. Inside the Arsenale, the rhythm of work was measured, the hammering of nails and the scratching of pens in equal measure. Even the workers' daily attendance was logged by clerks who noted absences, lateness, and illness, with small marks in the margin. The Republic's ships were not born from chaos, but from calm repetition. When a galley was completed, it was entered into the Libro delle Navi, the Book of Ships. There it would remain, listed with its tonnage, its armaments, and the name of its captain. Each voyage it undertook would generate its own subledger, the Giornale di Bordo, the ship's journal, a detailed log of weather, crew, provisions, and expenditures. If the ship sank, its record did not vanish. It was closed with a final note. Perduta in mare, Anno Domini, lost at sea, but not lost to history. Anno note. In this way, Venice conquered the sea not by force, but by filing. Its empire was an empire of accounting. The quiet watchers. While Venice's merchants and craftsmen worked by daylight, another set of officials worked by lamplight. The Council of Ten, the Republic's shadowy guardians, oversaw security and espionage. Their methods, too, were bureaucratic coded letters, secret reports, careful archives of confessions and investigations. It was said that nothing happened in Venice without being written down somewhere. Anonymous denunciations, denunzi segrete, could be submitted through the mouths of carved stone lions, known as bocce di leone. Scattered throughout the city, citizens could accuse their neighbors of smuggling, bribery, or heresy. Always in writing. The Council of Ten filed even these whispers, indexing them by year, district, and category. The result was a city that knew itself intimately, though not always comfortably. Venetians lived among their own paperwork. Their lives reflected back to them in copies and reports. And yet, this was not tyranny. It was a peculiar form of civic faith, a belief that order could prevent chaos. To a Venetian, freedom did not mean the absence of rules. It meant that the rules were clearly written, available for all to read. The bureaucracy was not an enemy, but a mirror one that showed citizens their place in the great pattern of the Republic, the weight of memory. As the 17th century approached, the weight of Venice's memory began to show. Shelves sagged beneath the growing piles of ledgers and decrees. Rooms once airy and bright became cramped with books, their bindings coated with salt dust. Archivists, men whose faces were pale from candlelight, worked through the nights, reorganizing old volumes, stitching torn pages, and cross-referencing forgotten files. They did not see themselves as historians. They were caretakers of continuity. And yet, as they worked, They could feel time pressing in from beyond the lagoon. Portugal now traded directly with India. Spain controlled the Americas. The Dutch were rising, armed with their own ledgers and superior ships. Venice's monopoly on the flow of goods and information was slipping. The Republic responded as it always had, with paperwork. It issued decrees to regulate new trade routes, laws to control luxury imports, and edicts to stabilize prices. But each new law required new offices, and each office produced new reports. The city grew quieter, under the weight of its own administration. What had once been an elegant system began to feel like a web one that even the Doge could no longer see in full. It was said, half in jest, that if every Venetian document were stacked together, it would reach the bell tower of San Marco. No one dared to test the claim. Still, the bureaucracy held. While other empires collapsed in revolts or coups, Venice endured through paperwork, flexible enough to bend, stable enough to persist. The ledgers absorbed everything: losses, debts, shifting alliances. Nothing vanished completely. Even decay was recorded. A republic of habit. By the 1600s, Venice's commercial empire had become a habit more than a conquest. The merchant ships still sailed, though slower. The markets still bustled, though quieter. And the scribes still wrote, line after line, even as they knew the old formulas no longer yielded new wealth. In the chancery, one might find an old clerk, his eyes weak, his fingers stained carefully entering the price of pepper imported from Alexandria. Even though the Dutch now sold the same spice for half the cost, he wrote it anyway, because the ledger had to be complete. For centuries, Venice's true religion had not been Catholicism or commerce. It had been continuity. To stop recording was to stop existing. So, the Republic persisted, one line at a time. In the dim offices of the Chancery, a young apprentice once asked his master why they still copied old decrees. Knowing the world had moved on, the old man smiled faintly and replied, "Because the sea forgets. But paper remembers." It was a strange answer, both comforting and ominous. For if paper remembers everything, then nothing ever truly ends. And so the Republic of Venice, even as it drifted into decline, found a kind of immortality in its archives, preserved not in marble, but in margins. By the early 18th century, Venice had become a museum of itself. Its lagoons were as calm as ever. Its bells still chimed over the water, and its gondoliers still sang softly as they ferried passengers through narrow canals. To the visitor, the Republic seemed eternal, serene, untouched, floating between sky and sea. But inside its palaces and offices, another sound echoed more quietly. The shuffle of old papers being moved, reordered, and forgotten. Venice had once been a city of merchants, explorers, and innovators. Now, it was a city of custodians. The same bureaucracy that had once made it powerful had turned into a kind of slow enchantment, preserving the city perfectly, but also trapping it in amber. The ledgers, the decrees, the minute accounts of grain and salt still flowed from the chancery like a heartbeat. But the world outside had stopped listening, the office that outlived the empire. In a small room near the Doge's palace, overlooking a narrow canal, there sat an archivist named Lorenzo Morosini. He was not a nobleman, though his surname echoed that of old Doges, but a simple clerk in the Cancelleria Inferiore, the lower office of the Chancery. Every morning, he arrived before sunrise, unlocked the door, and lit 2 candles. Then, as the city stirred to life outside, he would begin his ritual, sorting, binding, and labeling. He worked, not for glory, but for consistency. Each document he handled was a piece of a story: a contract between a spice merchant and a ship owner, an edict from the Council of 10 about smuggling, a tax receipt for a fisherman from Chioggia. He would brush the dust from the parchment, flatten the creases, and write the date neatly in red ink. Then he would place it into a bound volume, tie it with cord, and mark its spine. Archivio Stato, Registro 1000, 147, Commerce with the Levant, 1000, 721, 1725. For Morosini, as for all clerks of his kind, this was the true pulse of Venice. The rest, the politics, the foreign embassies, the gossip of nobles was transient. But the ledgers, the documents, the seal of the winged lion, those were eternal. He would sometimes pause and listen to the water lapping against the stone beneath his window. The sound, he thought, was like the turning of pages, the illusion of continuity. Venice, by then, was poor in coin, but rich in habit. Its ships still left port, but most were chartered by foreign merchants, Dutch, English, or Austrian. Its trade routes, once guarded by proud Venetian convoys, now relied on the goodwill of others. And yet, every transaction, however small, was still entered faithfully into the ledgers. The Senate still met, the Doge still wore his corno ducale, that curious, horn-shaped hat, and the Republic still issued decrees with solemn language and crimson seals. But the decrees now governed smaller and smaller things. The width of gondola oars, the regulation of tavern hours, the number of candles allowed in a chapel. When a law was passed to regulate the colours of merchant flags, one senator reportedly sighed, "Once we ruled the sea, now we debate the shade of blue." Still, the clerks copied the decree into the records. In the Council of Ten's secret archive, reports arrived daily, not about foreign intrigue, but about smuggling in the lagoon, or a baker who shorted his customers by an ounce of flour. The machinery of surveillance continued, but its targets had grown small, almost domestic. The Republic was no longer defending an empire, it was preserving a rhythm, the city that remembered too much. By the mid-18th century, the Archivio di Stato had become one of the largest collections of paper in Europe. Visitors from other states marveled at its scope. More than 1,000 years of documents, organized with an obsessive precision. There were entire rooms devoted to salt, others to wool, others to the canal repairs of each parish. One could trace, from parchment to parchment, the journey of a single merchant family from the 1300s to the present day. It was magnificent, but also paralyzing. When a new law was proposed, clerks would search through centuries of precedent to ensure no contradiction. A decision that might have taken a day elsewhere took months in Venice, because the Republic could never forget. Its memory, once its strength, had become its weight. A senator once described the state as a ship made of ledgers, sailing in circles. It was not entirely untrue. The city's economy had shifted toward tourism, a strange novelty at the time. Foreign aristocrats came to admire the canals, the festivals, and the masquerades. They marveled at the same palaces that Venetian accountants were struggling to maintain. Gold from trade was replaced by gold from entertainment. And still, every ducat was recorded. The quiet invasion. In 1797, the sound of order was broken. From the north came Napoleon Bonaparte, young and confident, marching with the speed of a new century. The French army crossed the Alps, defeating Austrian forces, and descended toward the Venetian mainland. Venice, ancient and neutral, hoped to remain untouched as it always had. But neutrality is a delicate thing. French agents accused Venice of harboring Austrian troops. Skirmishes broke out near Verona. The Senate convened, debated, postponed. Even as the French army approached the lagoon, the clerks of the Chancery continued to record the day's receipts, seal contracts, and file ship permits. They wrote, because writing was what Venetians did. On the 12th of May 1797, the Grand Council, that ancient body of patricians, gathered for the last time. The Doge, Lodovico Manin, sat quietly beneath the painted ceilings of the ducal hall, his eyes fixed on the floor. The senators voted, almost mechanically, to dissolve the Republic rather than resist. It was a decision made not in rage or despair, but in weariness. After more than 1,000 years, La Serenissima simply stopped. There were no riots, no fires, no dramatic last stands. Only silence, and then the slow rustle of clerks packing up their ledgers for the new French administration. The paper that endured. When Napoleon's officials entered the Doge's palace, they were astonished to find that every document, every file, every record was in perfect order. The Republic had died, but its paperwork remained immaculate. They could govern the city almost instantly, because Venice had already written down everything about itself. In a sense, the French inherited not a city, but an archive. Napoleon ordered the removal of many artworks and treasures, but he left the archives untouched. Even conquerors, it seemed, understood the sacredness of Venetian record-keeping. Later, when Austrian rule replaced the French, the same pattern continued. The ledgers were never burned, never scattered. They were too precious, too complete. The bureaucracy, like a ghost, outlived every ruler. Today, those same archives still exist, thousands upon thousands of volumes resting quietly in the Archivio di Stato di Venezia, in the old Franciscan monastery of the Frari. Their pages hold not the roar of empire, but its echo in voices, receipts, marginal notes, written in calm, looping script. Each one a breath of the city that once ruled the sea. The final reflection. Venice did not fall because of war or corruption, though both played their parts. It fell because it became what it loved most, a perfect record. A city so devoted to remembering itself that it forgot how to change. And yet, there is a kind of peace in that ending. For while other empires vanished into dust, Venice remained preserved in ink. It became the memory of its own greatness, and in that memory, it continues to live. If you visit Venice today and walk near the Frari, you can still sense it, the faint smell of parchment, the slow breath of history sleeping beneath the stone. Somewhere inside, a clerk's careful handwriting from 5 centuries ago still says, received 3 barrels of salt, paid 2 ducats tax, a small, meaningless note. But in it, the soul of the Republic still endures calm, precise, and quietly eternal. Because sometimes, survival is not about glory. It's about documentation. You are walking along a Roman road. It is straight, unnaturally straight, cutting across hills and valleys, like a line drawn by an impatient god. The stones beneath your feet are worn smooth, the kind of smoothness that comes from centuries of sandals, hooves, and cartwheels. The air smells of dust, olive trees, and iron. Somewhere ahead, you can hear the low murmur of voices, men speaking Latin, Greek, Aramaic, Egyptian, all subjects of the same vast machine. This is not a road for travelers. It is a road for information, because the Roman Empire, more than anything else, was a civilization of measurement. It measured land, grain, taxes, and people, especially people. It counted them, recorded them, and taxed them. To the Romans, to be alive within their borders was to exist in a ledger. The Bureau of the Census. Every 5 years, in the early days of the Republic, Rome performed its most sacred act, the census. It was not a casual survey. It was a ritual, half religious, half administrative, that defined who belonged to Rome. The censors, 2 of the highest magistrates, stood in the open air of the Campus Martius, near the Tiber. Citizens came forward one by one, giving their name, their family, their property, their slaves, and their worth. It was not a negotiation. It was a declaration of existence. To lie was a crime against the state and against the gods. The census did more than count. It classified. From a few statements of wealth and lineage, the entire structure of Roman society was built. The rich were placed in the highest ranks of military service, the poor in the lowest, and those with nothing, the capitae, censi, counted by their ether, heads barely registered at all. Rome did not ask what you believed, it asked what you owned, because taxes were not punishment, they were identity, counting the empire. As the Republic became an empire, the census spread outward, first to Italy, then to the provinces. What had once been a local ritual became a continent-spanning bureaucracy. Census officials, scribes, and surveyors, censitores, tabulariae, agrimensores, travelled along the network of imperial roads, setting up temporary offices in towns, temples, and markets. Each province had its own register, or census tabula, written in wax tablets or papyrus scrolls. The data they collected names, ages, occupations, property flowed back toward Rome like tributaries feeding a great river of numbers. And from these numbers, the empire drew its strength. Taxes could be predicted. Military service could be assigned. Grain shipments could be planned to the exact measure. It was, in many ways, a miracle of organization. A single administrator in Alexandria might know how much wheat would be harvested in the Nile Delta, how much could be shipped to Rome, and how much should be taxed in kind. A clerk in Hispania might record the number of vineyards producing surplus wine, and in the capital itself, teams of scribes would compile these reports into ledgers stored in the tabularium. The great record office at the foot of the Capitoline Hill. Imagine it. The smell of wax, the weight of scrolls, the sound of styluses, scratching against wood, men in togas sitting beneath flickering oil lamps, copying numbers, names, and property lists into registers taller than a man. The Roman Empire was built not just on legions, but on lists, the agrimensores, the men who drew the world. At the heart of this vast machinery were the agrimensores, the land surveyors. They were not soldiers, but they carried staffs and wore belts like officers. They marched across conquered territories, marking boundaries, dividing fields, and measuring distances in units called actus and jugera. To a Roman surveyor, the earth was not landscape. It was geometry. They used simple tools, the groma for right angles, the chorobates for levelling, and ropes of knotted hemp for measurement. From their work came the grid-like fields that still shape parts of Europe and North Africa today. Every farm, every road, every tax was born from their calculations. When the empire annexed a new province, Gaul, Syria, Egypt, the agrimensores arrived first, even before the governors. They divided the land into units for taxation, called centuriae, and mapped them meticulously. The conquered might resist soldiers, but they could not resist paperwork. In one Roman manual on surveying, a line reads almost poetically, "Let every field be known, for the unknown field is the root of disorder." That was the Roman creed, to make everything known. The everyday machinery of order. Outside the cities, in the villages and estates, life under the Roman census was ordinary and continuous. Each year, local magistrates collected taxes in coin or in kind, wheat, oil, wine. Collectors, known as publicani, rode from villa to villa, keeping tallies on wax tablets that would later be transcribed onto parchment scrolls. Most were not cruel, merely diligent. They weighed the grain, counted the jars, and noted the family names of each taxpayer. Sometimes a farmer might offer a gift, a jug of olive oil, a loaf of bread, not as a bribe, but as part of the ritual politeness of bureaucracy. In many places, the publicani were more familiar than the emperor himself. Their handwriting, more than the emperor's decrees, shaped people's lives. The process was slow, repetitive, and deeply Roman. There were few surprises. The tax came, it was recorded, it was filed, and for the average citizen, this dull predictability was a kind of peace, because if you were counted, you belonged. The empire as a ledger. By the time of Augustus, the first emperor, the Roman census had become the nervous system of the empire. Augustus himself boasted in his Res Gestae that he took 3 great censuses, each one counting millions of citizens. He saw numbers not as abstractions, but as power. For every name written down represented a man who could fight, a field that could produce grain, a coin that could be taxed. In one marble inscription from a provincial town, the text simply reads, "We, the counted, acknowledge Caesar." That was the essence of Roman control, not through fear, but through enumeration. An empire could not be everywhere, but its paperwork could. The Roman network of cursus publicus, the imperial postal and courier system, carried not only messages, but census returns and tax reports. Official couriers on horseback, wearing bronze insignia, galloped between provincial capitals and Rome, changing horses at relay stations called mutationes. Each report they carried was a thread in the web of imperial administration. Even the emperor himself, distant, divine, aloof, depended on the accuracy of men who could spell correctly, the weight of counting. But there was a cost to such order. For those who lived at the margins of empire, shepherds, traders, wanderers, the census was not inclusion, but intrusion. To be counted meant to be found. To be found meant to be taxed. Many slipped into the hills or deserts to escape the scribes' pens. Even whole villages sometimes vanished from the records, their inhabitants scattering to avoid the next census. Yet the empire never gave up. It always returned, measuring, dividing, recording. Each new emperor might issue decrees of mercy, tax reliefs, or amnesties, but always with the same intent: to keep the numbers correct. To the Romans, the census was not an act of compassion or curiosity. It was maintenance, the endless calibration of empire, and perhaps, in the quiet moments of evening, the scribes themselves understood the futility of it. The ink dried, the papyrus cracked, the wax tablets wore smooth from erasures and rewritings. Still they wrote, because that was what civilization required, to keep track of itself, even when no one was watching. The quiet greatness. The greatness of Rome was not just its architecture or legions, but its persistence in record-keeping. Through the monotony of counting and the repetition of writing, it created continuity, a sense that life, however small, was part of something immense and stable. Even after the Western Empire began to crumble, the habit of the census remained. Local bishops, tax collectors, and landlords continued to record names, debts, and harvests, ghosts of a bureaucracy that refused to die. To be Roman, even in decline, was to keep the books balanced. And so, the roads that once carried soldiers and traders continued to carry officials with tablets and lists. The empire's geography became a ledger made of stone. The Roman Empire's genius was not that it conquered the world, but that it counted it patiently, precisely, endlessly. And somewhere in that vast act of administration, humanity found a strange kind of comfort. To be recorded was to endure. To have one's name in a census was to be known, even briefly, to history. But as the centuries wore on, a question began to rise like heat from the stones of those ancient roads. What happens when the counting never stops? When the empire forgets why it began measuring in the first place? The Roman Empire was not just a thing of marble and military parades. It was, in its daily rhythm, an empire of tables, long wooden ones, covered in scrolls, tablets, and ink. Every governor, every general, Every tax collector depended on the men who sat behind those tables, the tabulari, the record keepers. To most Romans, they were invisible. They were not celebrated in statues, nor praised in poetry. Yet, without them, the empire would have crumbled under its own weight of information. Their task was not heroic. It was clerical, repetitive, precise, and utterly essential. The tabularium, Rome's memory. At the edge of the Roman Forum stood the tabularium, the great archive of the Republic, and later the Empire. Built of heavy tufa and travertine, it overlooked the Senate House and the Temple of Concord. It was a fortress of paper, or what passed for paper in those days. Rolls of papyrus tied with linen cords, wax tablets stacked in cedar chests, bronze plaques engraved with official decrees. Each room was lined with niches and shelves, labelled with small tags of ivory or lead. Within them rested the documents that bound Rome together: tax records, military rolls, land deeds, citizenship grants, and legal contracts. Inside, the air was dry and smelled faintly of beeswax and dust. Torches burned in sconces, their smoke marking the ceilings black. You can imagine the sound, a low murmur of clerks reading aloud to one another, the soft scrape of wax being erased and rewritten, the slap of sandals on stone floors. The men who worked there were the custodes tabularii, guardians of the record. Their duty was not to interpret, only to preserve. In the empire's eyes, these men were not thinkers, but vessels of memory. They were, in their way, the empire's conscience quiet, watchful, unthanked, the work of a day. Let us imagine one such clerk. His name might be Gaius Valerius, a freedman in the service of the state. He arrives before dawn, carrying a small lamp and his stylus case. His tunic is plain, his sandals well worn. He will sit for most of the day, copying. On his desk, a wax tablet, a roll of papyrus, a small pot of ink, and a thin reed pen sharpened to a delicate point. The document before him is a tax register from Campania, lists of names, values of property, quantities of grain owed to the state. His task is to make a fair copy for the governor's office in Capua. The work requires a peculiar patience. He must transcribe numbers carefully, names accurately, and weights consistently. Each error could mean confusion, or worse, accusation. Roman bureaucracy did not tolerate carelessness. At midday, he pauses to stretch his back. The light through the window turns golden. Outside, he can hear the noise of carts passing over the forum. Stones, merchants, priests, soldiers. Inside, everything remains the same. The smell of oil lamps, the steady sound of styluses, the endless quiet repetition of names. This is what holds the empire together. Not the roar of the Colosseum, but the scratch of styluses in dim offices. The imperial bureaucracy expands. As Rome expanded, so did its bureaucracy. Under Emperor Claudius, the imperial civil service began to take shape. Thousands of freedmen and slaves managing the correspondence, accounts, and logistics of the empire. They worked in departments known as officia, the Arationibus, responsible for finances, the Libelis, handling petitions and legal appeals, the Memoria, maintaining imperial records and decrees, the Studiis, overseeing research and documentation. Each office was a small world of routine. Letters arrived, were copied, sealed, and sent onward by courier. Payments were recorded, stamped, and filed. Orders were acknowledged, countersigned, and stored. Most of these clerks never saw the emperor they served, but through their writing, he knew his empire. A shipment of grain in Egypt, a tax dispute in Gaul, a rebellion in Judea, all arrived at the imperial desk as words. Paperwork made the distant near. It turned thousands of miles into lines of ink. The language of control, Latin, was the language of power, but within the bureaucratic world, it developed a rhythm all its own, formulaic, exact, repetitive. Documents opened with the same phrases, by order of, concerning the census of, it has been, decided. Every line carried the weight of tradition, every signature the authority of the state. The handwriting itself, neat, slanted, and carefully formed, was a mark of identity. An unsteady script could ruin a career. Young scribes were trained in scriptura cursiva, the flowing hand used for speed, and capitalis rustica, the heavier hand used for official copies. In time, the clerical class developed its own silent pride. They were not noble, but they were indispensable. They were the translators of empire, turning chaos into order through words. And in that act of translation, Rome discovered a kind of immortality, because to be written down was to endure. The empire of paper. By the 2nd century CE, the bureaucratic system of the Roman Empire was staggering in scale. Each province had its tabularium, connected to a chain of sub-offices, prefectures, and municipal archives. Every contract, will, or sale was registered. Every census return, tax record, and shipment was noted. Even soldiers' service histories were recorded on thin sheets of papyrus, folded and sealed with wax. There were forms for everything: libellus census, declaration of property, tabulae frumentarii grain distributions, diplomata militaria, veteran certificates, commentarii magistratuum, daily logs of official activity. Rome, in essence, had invented the concept of paperwork as civilization. Where other empires ruled through fear or tribute, Rome ruled through documentation, and through that dull, orderly system came stability. Provinces that had once been rebellious grew accustomed to Roman administration because it was predictable. Taxes came on time, justice was recorded, property was protected. The pen replaced the sword as the symbol of permanence, the bureaucrat's faith. To a modern observer, this might seem tedious, but for those inside it, Roman bureaucracy offered something close to meaning. It was an act of participation in something far larger than oneself. Gaius Valerius, our imagined clerk, might never see Britain or Syria, but his numbers shaped both. When he copied a grain total or verified a tax receipt, he was not just preserving order, he was part of it. The empire was a living organism, and the clerks were its nerves. Their faith was not religious, but administrative, a belief that through meticulous attention, chaos could be defeated. They could not stop wars, plagues, or politics, but they could keep the records straight. Decay and paper dust. Yet the longer an empire lasts, the heavier its records become. By the late 3rd century, Rome's bureaucracy had begun to sag under its own weight. New offices were created to manage old ones. New ledgers to correct older ledgers. Duplicates of duplicates filled storerooms. One historian, Ammianus Marcellinus, wrote with weary sarcasm, "In every city, paper outnumbers men." Archivists complained of mice eating scrolls, of mildew in storage rooms, of confusion between old and new tax registers. The order that had once been Rome's strength became its burden. The act of maintaining control became an empire's obsession. Still, the clerks wrote, still, the census continued. Even when the legions faltered, the paperwork did not. The habit of recording the Roman compulsion to know survived every political crisis. The quiet legacy. When the Western Empire finally fell in the 5th century, its conquerors, Visigoths, Vandals, Ostrogoths, destroyed temples and looted cities. But in many towns, the archives were left untouched. They found no treasure there, only scrolls. Yet those scrolls carried something extraordinary, the continuity of governance. Even under barbarian kings, the Roman administrative system endured. They, too, began keeping ledgers and censuses, using Latin words, Roman forms. The empire, in a sense, had been copied into memory. And centuries later, when monks in scriptoria began to record the chronicles of their age, they borrowed Roman tables, dates, and document styles. The tabulari had quietly shaped not just their own world, but ours. For wherever there is an office, a list, or a form, there is a faint echo of the tabularium. You can almost hear it, the rustle of papyrus, the murmur of clerks, the endless counting that made a continent feel ordered. And yet, in that immense archive of civilization, a question begins to stir. Quiet, but persistent. If every detail of a world can be recorded, can anything truly be forgotten? It is the 4th century of our era. The Roman Empire is old, still vast, still proud, but heavy with its own history. The roads are cracked in places, the stones loosened by centuries of carts. In some provinces, the aqueducts leak, and the legions no longer march with the same precision. Yet, every 15 years, as if by instinct, the census begins again. Messengers ride out from Ravenna, the imperial capital of the West, carry sealed orders written in a neat bureaucratic hand. Let every man be counted, his household recorded, his land measured, and his due declared. It is a phrase that has changed little in 500 years. Even as emperors fall and provinces revolt, the machinery of paperwork continues. The empire, as one poet remarked, is now a filing cabinet in motion. The bureaucrats of the late empire, the later empire's administration, had grown immense, tens of thousands of officials spread across the provinces. The Emperor Diocletian, seeking to restore order after a century of chaos, had divided the empire into smaller, more manageable units. Dioceses, each governed by a vicarius. Below them, praesides and curiales handled the local work, collecting taxes, verifying births and deaths, maintaining registers. It was a web of offices, each dependent on another. Diocletian also standardized the tax system in a vast reform known as the capitatio iugatio, a formula combining people, capita, and land, uga. In this system, every human, every ox, every field was assigned a value in units of productivity. It was meant to be fair. It became, inevitably, suffocating. For the first time, taxes were calculated not simply on property, but on potential. A farmer who had once been taxed for his harvest was now taxed for what his land could produce, whether he grew it or not. The bureaucracy was relentless. It did not understand drought or plague. To the imperial scribes, the numbers were reality. If the records said the harvest was good, then it must have been good. The world of the curiales. In the cities of the late empire, a new class carried the burden of this administrative machine. The curiales, or local councillors. They were the municipal elite, educated, landowning men expected to collect taxes from their communities and send them to the imperial treasury. At first, it was an honor. Over time, it became a sentence. As the empire's finances strained, the curiales were held personally responsible for shortfalls. If a farmer could not pay, the curialis had to pay in his place. Many bankrupted themselves in loyalty to the state. Others fled, hiding in monasteries or distant estates. Imperial edicts from the 4th and 5th centuries are filled with the same desperate refrain: let no curialis abandon his post. Let none seek refuge among the clergy. Those who flee shall be returned to their duty. But the exodus continued. The empire was running out of men willing to keep its books. The endless revisions inside the chancelleries of Constantinople and Ravenna, the paperwork multiplied. Each office demanded reports from the next. Each governor asked for confirmations. Each scribe made copies. The empire's own systems became recursive, self-checking, self-correcting, self-consuming. Every new emperor issued reforms to simplify the bureaucracy, and every reform added new layers. One surviving, a document from Egypt, dated around 400 CE, shows a tax register with 12 different hands correcting, annotating, and approving it over 30 years. The peasants it recorded were likely dead by the time the final entry was written. The empire, like an aging scholar, was spending all its energy not on conquest, but on maintaining its notes. The census as survival. And yet, there was something deeply human in this persistence. Even as towns shrank and trade faltered, the census continued. It gave structure to decline. It imposed a kind of dignity on the slow unraveling of order. In the province of Egypt, scribes still copied lists of taxpayers on papyrus, even after the legions had withdrawn. In Gaul, where barbarian tribes now ruled in the emperor's name, local officials still sent reports to Rome, though Rome no longer answered. The act of writing had become a habit, a way of remembering that the world once made sense. One late inscription from North Africa, worn and nearly unreadable, carries a phrase both proud and resigned. We record, therefore we endure. The empire had become its own archive. Paperwork amid collapse. When the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 CE, they carried away gold, silver, and statues, but not scrolls. In the months that followed, Roman clerks quietly resumed their duties. They repaired what records they could, drew up new tax rolls, and noted the loss of property. One account, from the historian Procopius, tells of a city in Italy where, during a siege, clerks continued to write receipts for grain distributed to the defenders. No one was sure if the city would survive, but the ledgers would be complete. It was as if, in the midst of ruin, the scribes found comfort in their repetition. Perhaps they believed that so long as the books were in order, civilization itself might be preserved. The emperor's accountant. By the 5th century, the emperor in the West, whether Honorius, Valentinian, or any of their weary successors, ruled through documents. They rarely led armies or built monuments. Instead, they signed edicts, read reports, and approved accounts. One letter from the prefect of Italy to Emperor Honorius reads almost plaintively, "Most serene Lord, the accounts of the province are balanced, only the world is not." The emperor's answer has not survived, but one can imagine his silence a kind of bureaucratic faith that the paperwork mattered even when everything else was falling apart. The last census, the last official census of the Western Roman Empire, is lost to history. There is no surviving decree, no final ledger. At some point, perhaps in the mid-5th century, perhaps later, the orders simply stopped coming. The clerks waited. They sharpened their pens. They asked one another if the forms would arrive this year, but none did. The empire, which had once measured the world with such precision, had finally fallen silent. And yet, its habit did not die. In the Eastern Empire Byzantium, the census continued, reshaped and renewed. Greek replaced Latin, parchment replaced papyrus, but the instinct to count and classify endured. Centuries later, the Ottomans would do the same. And later still, modern nations would rediscover the Roman genius for record-keeping censuses, taxes, land registries, all echoes of the ancient tabularii. The empire had dissolved, but its logic remained. What? The Romans taught the future. The Roman census was more than administration. It was the foundation of the modern state. The idea that a government should know its people, measure its land, and manage its resources through records rather than chaos. Even today, when you fill out a census form or register a property, you are participating in a ritual that began on the dusty roads of the ancient world. You are being counted not as a number, but as part of a system that believes order is possible. Perhaps that is the Roman legacy, the belief that civilization is nothing more and nothing less than the act of keeping track. The last clerk. In your mind's eye, picture him the last Roman scribe, somewhere in Ravenna or Carthage, sitting by the light of an oil lamp. The empire around him is fading. The armies are gone, the officials scattered. Still, he writes, his hand is steady. He records the names of men who will never read them, taxes that will never be collected, reports that will never be delivered. When he finishes, he sands the ink, ties the scroll, and seals it with wax. Then he places it on the shelf, beside thousands of others, the silent heartbeat of an empire that has forgotten why it beats. Perhaps he pauses then, looking out the window at the dark sea, and wonders not whether Rome will fall, but whether anyone will still care to count when it does. The Roman Empire began by counting its people. It ended by counting its losses. And somewhere between the first and the last census lies the strange, enduring beauty of order, the human desire to measure life, even as it disappears. You are standing on the edge of the Sahara, sometime in the 14th century. Before you, the horizon wavers not in clouds, but in heat. The earth is the color of old bone, and the air tastes of iron. You are in Tagazar, a salt mining settlement deep in the desert, far north of the Mali Empire. There are no trees here, no fields, no birds, only men, camels, and salt. Everything, even the huts, is built from it. The walls are blocks of crude, grey-white salt, stacked like stone. The roofs are palm mats carried here from far to the south. You can hear the faint crackle of wind passing over the brittle walls, the crunch of salt underfoot. It exists only to extract to feed an empire's appetite for one of the most precious things in the medieval world. The currency of survival salt in the Mali Empire was not merely seasoning, it was currency. It preserved meat and fish, kept bodies alive in the heat, and could be traded weight for weight with gold. The merchants of Mali called it white gold, and they meant it literally. Without salt, a caravan could not survive the desert. Without it, cities like Timbuktu and Gao would wither. And so, men came to this impossible place, miners from the Tuareg tribes, traders from the Niger River towns, slaves and hired workers from distant villages. They hacked at the earth with iron picks, cutting the salt in great slabs called amale, each about a meter long and weighing as much as a man's chest. Each slab was lifted, brushed free of dust, and stacked like bricks into pyramids that gleamed in the sun. When enough had been gathered, they were bound in rope and loaded onto camels for the long journey south. The salt was heavy, the desert heavier. The caravan forms. The caravan begins at dawn. The leader, the caravan chief, stands on a small rise, wrapped in indigo cloth. His face is veiled, leaving only his eyes visible. Around him, the camels kneel in rows, their long necks bending gracefully as handlers fasten the slabs of salt onto their backs. Each camel carries 3 or 4 blocks, about 300 kilograms in total. The animals groan softly as they rise, their loads swaying. A caravan of 500 camels is not rare. Some reach 1,000. They will travel for nearly a month, perhaps more, across a land where water is more valuable than gold. The men march alongside, wrapped in turbans against the sun, their footprints swallowed by sand almost as soon as they fall. In the stillness of morning, the caravan begins to move slow, rhythmic, deliberate. No one speaks. There is no need. The desert absorbs all sound. The desert's geometry. The Sahara is not one desert, but many. From Tagazar to Timbuktu stretches a corridor of shifting worlds, flat gravel plains, dunes that move like tides, dry valleys littered with fossil shells, the ghosts of ancient seas. To navigate, the guides use more than stars. They read the wind, the color of sand, the pattern of rock. They remember each well, each cluster of stones, each horizon line. Every dune has a name, every dry wadi, a story. Their mental maps are more accurate than any drawn chart of their time. For in the desert, memory is the only compass. When night falls, the stars rise fierce and infinite. The caravan halts, the camels kneel, and small fires flicker among the loads of salt. Men drink a little water mixed with camel milk, eat millet bread, and wrap themselves in cloaks against the freezing wind. The desert is a place of extremes. Heat that burns the soles of your feet by day, cold that stings your bones by night. Between the two, life exists in a narrow band of endurance. The rhythm of the march each day follows the same pattern. Wake before dawn, load the camels, walk until the sun climbs high, rest in the shadow of the loads, walk again as evening cools the sand. The sound of the march becomes hypnotic, the shuffle of hooves, the clink of harnesses, the whisper of wind across dunes. Every few hours, the caravan stops at a bur, a shallow well lined with stones. The water tastes of metal, sometimes of salt, itself. It is drawn by hand, poured into leather skins, and shared sparingly. The men speak little. They count their steps in silence, or recite verses from the Quran. Sometimes, a low song rises a chant of rhythm more than melody, something to measure the distance by. No one hurries. The desert punishes haste, trade and trust. When you walk among them, you see the order beneath the quiet. Each trader carries a small bag of gold dust, wrapped in cloth. Each salt miner has his tally, his count of slabs. Each camel driver knows which beasts belong to which master. There are rules, unwritten but absolute. No theft within the caravan. No argument that delays the march. No man left behind unless he chooses stay. The Tuareg guards tall, silent, veiled in blue, ride ahead and behind, spears resting across their saddles. Their job is not only to protect from raiders, but to keep peace within. For in the desert, discipline is survival. Sometimes, the caravan meets another heading north carrying gold, ivory, or cloth. The two groups stop, exchange greetings, compare news of wells and weather, and continue. There is no chaos here, no market shouting. Trade in the Sahara moves like water, underground, steady, unseen, essential. The empire beyond the dunes. Far to the south, beyond the desert's edge, the Mali Empire waits its cities alive with scholars, merchants, and kings. Timbuktu, Gao, Niani, places that seem almost mythic to those who have not seen them. From these cities flow gold and grain, textiles and slaves. To them come salt, copper, and wisdom from the north. The Sahara is the bridge between two worlds, the Mediterranean and West Africa. Sahel, desert, and savanna. Each caravan is a thread in that tapestry, connecting places that would otherwise remain strangers. In the great markets of Timbuktu, the salt blocks are stacked like fortresses. Merchants from Morocco weigh them beside scales of gold. A single block of salt might buy a man his freedom, or a camel his lifetime's feed. The empire thrives not because of conquest, but because of movement. The rhythm of trade repeated year after year, season after season. The silence of the dunes. There are no monuments in the desert, no tombs of kings, no carved inscriptions, only tracks, faint, winding, and soon erased by wind. Yet those who cross it leave their mark in another way, through continuity. For centuries, the salt caravans follow the same routes, the same wells, the same patterns of rest. They are not explorers. They are maintainers of memory. Every guide passes his knowledge to his son. Every merchant teaches the value of trust to his apprentice. The desert, indifferent to all, becomes a teacher of patience. Even the wind, relentless, seems to whisper its lesson. Everything moves, slowly, inevitably, and those who endure by rhythm, the weight of empire. As the caravan nears its halfway point, the horizon changes. The dunes flatten, and a faint line of acacia trees appears, the first sign of the Sahel. The air grows softer. The wind carries the smell of earth. The men quicken their pace. They can almost imagine the sound of river water, though it is still days away. In this moment, the salt, heavy, silent, crystalline, feels almost alive. It is more than trade. It is the pulse of a world that connects desert miners to river kings, slaves to scholars, camels to gold. Each block of salt is a fragment of geography, a piece of empire. And yet, as the caravan marches on, a question lingers in the desert air, as thin and sharp as the wind itself. When everything depends on movement, what happens if the desert stops listening? You arrive at the edge of the desert. The dunes fall away behind you, and the horizon darkens into green and gold, the vast plain of the Sahel, where the Sahara ends and the savannah begins. It is a quiet transformation. The air feels heavier, fuller. The wind carries the smell of grass and water, and somewhere in the distance, you hear the faint cry of a bird. The caravan halts at a low ridge. Below lies a cluster of tents, then huts, and farther still, a line of trees that mark the Niger River, the great artery of the Mali Empire. For the first time in weeks, the men can see movement that is not their own. Fishermen paddling dugout canoes, children shouting on the banks, smoke rising from cooking fires. The long silence of the desert gives way to the gentle noise of life. The crossing. The last miles are the hardest. The camels, exhausted, shift their weight uneasily. The loads of salt clink and grind as the animals descend toward the river. Each slab has survived 1,000 miles of heat, sandstorms, and silence. Each now carries the promise of transformation, salt into gold. At the riverbank, men begin to unload the cargo. They form a line, passing the slabs from one shoulder to another, stacking them on wooden rafts bound with rope. The sun burns above, but the water is cool and brown, swirling gently around the edges of the rafts. The guides, Tuareg and Songhai alike, give thanks to God for the safe passage. They touch the water to their lips, whisper prayers in Arabic and in the old desert tongues. Then they push the rafts off, using long poles to steer into the slow current. The salt begins its second journey, this one by river, toward Timbuktu, the city of sand and scholarship. When you reach Timbuktu, it is not what distant travelers imagine. It is not a golden city or a palace of shining walls. It is a settlement of earth, sun-dried mud, clay, and straw, rising gently from the riverbank, like a mirage made solid. But beneath the dust lies something more powerful than stone: knowledge. Timbuktu, by the 14th century, is a crossroads of empires. It is where the merchants of the desert meet the scholars of the Sahel. Here, salt from Tagazar trades for gold from the forests of Wangara, and both exchange hands alongside books, thick manuscripts copied by candlelight in Arabic, Songhai, and Berber script. In narrow alleys, you hear the hum of bargaining, the low, deliberate murmur of trade. In shaded courtyards, students sit cross-legged, reciting lines of the Quran. And always, there is dust. It clings to skin, cloth, and parchment alike. A soft reminder that all things, no matter how grand, are touched by earth. The markets of exchange. The marketplace of Timbuktu stretches for hundreds of paces along the riverfront. There are no stalls of marble, no ornate awnings, only mats laid on the ground, baskets filled with millet, and mounds of salt gleaming in the sun. You see merchants from the north, tall men in blue veils standing beside their salt blocks. Facing them are men from the south, their garments dyed deep red or white, their hair bound in cloth. Between them lie the tools of barter: small brass scales, cowrie shells, bits of gold dust stored in tiny leather pouches. Trade here follows an ancient rhythm. Gold is weighed not in coins but in specks, poured carefully into scales balanced with pieces of salt. There is no shouting, only murmurs, only patience. The gold traders speak softly, and when a bargain is made, they touch their hands to their chests in mutual respect. A single transaction may take an hour, not because of distrust, but because of reverence. To exchange goods is to exchange trust, and in the Mali Empire, trust is the foundation of wealth, the quiet power of gold. In the rest of the world, gold is a symbol of vanity crowns, coins, and ornaments. In Mali, it is different. Gold is everywhere, yet invisible. The rulers of Mali do not allow foreign merchants to see where it is mined, nor to touch the raw nuggets that come from the southern forests. Gold, for the empire, is not luxury, it is stability. It funds armies and schools, mosques and roads. It allows rulers like Mansa Musa to build connections with distant lands and to proclaim the empire's strength without ever raising a sword. Mansa Musa's name, even now, travels with the wind. He is said to have made a pilgrimage to Mecca so grand that the markets of Cairo overflowed with his gold for years after he passed through. But what travelers often forget is that before his pilgrimage, he was a ruler of ledgers, a man who understood that gold only matters when it moves. In this way, gold and salt mirror each other. One shining, one dull, one rare, one abundant, both essential to life, both defined by their journey. The House of Learning. Not far from the market stands the Sankore Mosque, its walls rising in ridged tiers of packed earth, strengthened by the trunks of palm wood that jut from its surface like ribs. Inside, the air is cool and dim. The floor is covered in fine sand. Here, scholars from across the Islamic world gather from Cairo, Fez, and even distant Andalusia. They debate astronomy and law, philosophy and trade. They write on parchment, copy by hand, and recite aloud until every student can repeat each word. For them, knowledge is another kind of salt, something to be gathered, preserved, and shared. The empire's wealth, they say, lies not in gold or salt, but in learning. You hear a teacher explaining the movement of stars, another reciting the lineage of kings. The sound of quills scratching parchment mingles with the rustle of robes and the faint hum of wind outside. Even here, history moves slowly built, not by conquest, but by repetition. The bureaucrats of the river behind the scholars and merchants lies another kind of order, the quiet machinery of the empire. In shaded rooms, scribes record the caravan arrivals, the number of salt slabs, the weight of gold exchanged. Their tools are simple: reed pens, wooden tablets, and ink made from soot and gum. Their work is endless. Each transaction must be written down not for taxes alone, but to ensure that balance, once established, is maintained. These men are the silent architects of Mali's greatness. Without them, trade would collapse, trust would fray, and caravans would wander without destination. Their ledgers, often overlooked, are among the empire's most important treasures. They transform chaos into order, movement into record, the essence of civilization, faith in the flow. At dusk, the call to prayer drifts across the city. It echoes from the mud towers, soft and steady, answered by hundreds of voices. Men leave their stalls, women pause their cooking, scribes lay down their pens. The sun sinks, painting the horizon in copper. The air cools, and as the city bends toward a prayer, you feel the rhythm that unites it all. From the salt miners in Tagaza to the scholars in Timbuktu, all bound by the same silent faith in continuity. They know the desert gives and takes, the river rises and falls, trade flourishes and fades. But as long as men remember the roots, the wells, the words the empire endures, in the gathering dark, fires begin to glow again along the riverbanks. The caravan men rest, their camels unburdened, their salt turned to gold. Tomorrow, they will begin the long journey north again, because that is what history requires. Movement without end. The question. Beneath the dust, in the calm of evening, as the call to prayer fades, a question lingers, not of faith, but of fragility. Timbuktu shines with knowledge and trade, but even now, beyond the dunes, other powers stir. The sands shift, roots change, and empires forget what made them great. If salt was the empire's foundation constant, heavy, pure, what happens when the world no longer values what endures? The year is uncertain, perhaps the late 16th century, perhaps early in the 17th. The merchants no longer speak of Mansa Musa or his pilgrimage. Timbuktu still stands, but its walls are cracked, its markets quieter. The great Mali Empire has withered into smaller kingdoms, Songhai, Gao, Jenne, each ruling a fragment of what once was whole. The Sahara, though, remains unchanged. The wind still blows in the same directions, the dunes still shift like waves, and the desert's silence is still complete. But now, fewer men hear it. The decline of routes, the once busy road from Tagaza to Timbuktu is thinning. Caravans no longer number in the hundreds of camels. Many of the wells, once kept clear by generations of desert guides, are filling with sand. Old landmarks vanish, new dunes rise where none existed before. Salt still lies buried beneath the crust of Tagaza, but fewer hands dig for it. The miners, Tuareg, Berber, and enslaved laborers are restless. Rumors drift across the dunes. New trade routes have opened far, to the west, along the coast. There, foreign ships, Portuguese, then Spanish come bearing strange goods and strange ideas. Salt no longer flows south in the same measure. Now, other commodities, sugar, cloth, even enslaved people, move in its place. The rhythm has shifted. The pulse of the world has changed. The memory of sand still. Some men refuse to stop walking. They remember the old ways. Among them is Ibn Khalaf, a caravan leader in his 60s, born to a line of desert guides who have known no other life. He stands before the camels one last time, wrapping his indigo veil tight around his face. His son tells him it is no longer worth it, that the journey takes too long, the profits too small. But Ibn Khalaf does not measure worth in gold. He measures it in distance, in survival, in the feeling of the desert's wind on his skin. He gestures for the camels to unkneel. The handlers, fewer than before, load the salt slabs with slow precision. When the last rope is tied, the old man nods once, and the caravan begins to move. The desert accepts them as it always has, without notice. The long march north. The days pass without incident, and that itself is strange. No raiders appear on the horizon. No other caravans cross their path. Only sand and sky and silence. Each night, the men gather around a small fire, eating from a shared bowl of millet. They speak quietly of things that no longer exist. The glory of Mali, the wisdom of the scholars of Timbuktu, the price of salt in the old markets. Ibn Khalaf listens, but says little. He knows that memory, like the desert, can be both nourishment and mirage. In the morning, when the first light touches the dunes, he takes his compass from a pouch, a small, tarnished brass instrument from a trader in Fez. He aligns it to the rising sun, mutters a prayer, and begins the next leg of the journey, the changing wind. By the second week, a sandstorm rises. The horizon disappears. The air itself becomes dust. The men wrap their faces. The camels groan. The wind screams like a living thing. They move by instinct, trusting the desert's rhythm more than their own sight. Hours pass, or perhaps days. When the storm finally clears, half the water skins are gone, and 2 camels lie buried beneath the dunes. Ibn Khalaf says nothing. He looks to the sky, reading the stars, then leads them onward. To survive here requires no triumph, no glory, only continuity. And continuity